How are you on this coolish summer morning? Don't complain about the coolish. We were just down at Armidale again last week, and we have yet to see a summer there. Even though we've been there, I think 4 times in summer, we've still yet to see a summer there. It was cold as. One morning we actually put the fire on. It was so cold. So yeah, that we needed to mention. It's all just. How did you find the talk about the sleep state? Most of you are still reeling from it, actually. Have you noticed that? How many of you have now not had a nice night's sleep since then? A few of you? Yep. And many of you have noticed have gone into quite a lot of fear about the sleep state experiences as well. Now, we're not going to discuss the sleep state today because I want to discuss something that's quite basic with you today, and that is the principles of the way that God created for you to come to God. So the talk that we're having today is a part of the Relationship with God series. And the subject is the way. The reason why I'm calling it the way is that almost every celestial spirit calls it the way. And in fact, when I spoke of this way to God in the first century, I spoke of it as the way to God, the only way to God, actually. And so for that reason, almost all of the celestial spirits have used the same terminology over the last 2,000 years, referring to what you now call the divine love path. They don't actually call it the divine love path, they call it the way. And the way is the way, the only way to God, to having a relationship with God. Now, we've talked about the path of going to have a relationship with God many times before. But what I've noticed is this. Many of you are still not on it. But you think you're on it, which is actually a bit of a problem when you think about it. When you think you're going in a certain direction, it's like you're driving on the road that you think is to Brisbane, but you're actually driving to Perth, the opposite direction. And this is what we're often doing when it comes to our spiritual development, and that's what I would like to talk to you about. Somewhere here, I'm just looking for a Bible that I brought with me. Oh no, it's Sunday morning, right? We can get away with the Bible, can't we? Sunday morning. There are certain things that I did say that are listed in the Bible, and this is one of them that's quite close to accurate. It's from Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, for those of you who are taking notes. It says, "Go in through the narrow gate, because broad and spacious is the road leading off into destruction, and many are the ones going in through it. Whereas narrow is the gate and cramped the road leading off into life, and few are the ones finding it." Now, when most Christian religious people read those 2 verses, they assume they are on the narrow way leading to life. Do they not? Now, if we think about it, I've said few are the ones finding the narrow way to life. And how many Christians do we have on the planet around about at this point? About 1.5 to 2 billion? Does that seem like a few to you? No. So can you see that many of these 1.5 billion Christians must think they're on the way, but not actually be on it? if I said few are the ones finding it. Can you see that? Logically, that would make sense, surely. Now, the problem is that even a few of us have yet to find it, this same path, this same way. What I called in the first century the way to God. And what I would like to do today is explain to you why that is the case by going over some basic principles that we've already learned through the different presentations that have been done, and then re-examining or re-looking at your own life to see whether you're finding it the way that I've explained it or not. Does that make sense? Because quite often we think we understand what's being said, and from a logical perspective we get the logic of what's being said, but as yet, it's yet to actually hit our heart. It's yet to change our life. Our life has not substantially been modified by what we're doing. By what we're doing. And so, what I would like to do is for you to consider another verse that I've also another thing I also said, which is only a few verses later in Matthew 7, verse 21 to 23. I said, "Not everyone saying to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of the heavens, but the one doing the will of my Father who is in the heavens will. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and expel demons in your name and perform many powerful works in your name?' And yet then I will confess to them, 'I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Can you see it's the same principle? There'll be many people who believe they're even doing the right things. They're saying the right things, doing the right things, and yet at the end of the day, only the persons who are doing the will of God, what I called the will of God at that time, who are understanding the truth about the way, if you like, only those persons will actually be able to be in the celestial kingdom when they pass. No one else is able to. Not because God is selective, but because of the person exercising their own will and their own desire in different directions than what the way would indicate to follow. So when you look through the Bible with some of the statements that I've made, you will see that I was referring to two separate paths. So what I called the narrow gate is what you now know to be the divine love path. That's what many of you are calling it. And let's call it the way to God. Or God's way of love. Right? That's the narrow gate. And then there's this broad gate, which I said leads, and I did say it leads to the destruction of the soul generally. Even if you grow, there is still a detunement from the growth of the soul at some point in the future of this path. This is the broad gate that most people are taking. So you now know that as the natural love path. And if we put love in inverted commas, right, which is man's way of love. And again, I would put love in inverted commas because it's what we often think love to be, but not actually is. And it is not the way to God, it is the way to man's definition of God. Which for many men varies quite markedly. Some of them feel that they are God themselves. So for them, it's man's definition of the man's way to themselves. For others, they believe in a God, that an external God does exist. So it's the way to man's definition of that external God, not to God's definition of God. So they are the two gates. They are the choices that we have to follow. One way takes us right the way through an everlasting series of progressions that never end, as far as we are aware. The other takes us through a limiting process, which usually begins in what I've called and referred to as the hells of the spirit world, right the way through to development in love till you reach the sixth dimension or the sixth sphere of the spirit world. Whereas the narrow gate can take us from the hells of the spirit world right the way through to wherever it is. You could say to infinite development. Yes? That's the narrow gate. Now, you notice in the Bible it actually said, narrow is the gate and cramped the road. And this is something that a lot of us are still really having a lot of struggle and difficulty with. You see, we rebel against a close definition of truth. We would like the truth to be exactly what we would like it to be, and nothing more or less than that. And what you would like it to be is often very different to what I would like it to be, because of our different emotional injuries and hooks that we have, and our different addictions that we have. So when we say, oh, I don't want to be cramped in any way, what we're often feeling when we're cramped is restricted by others' definitions of things or God's definition of things. We feel a sense of restriction for some reason, and usually those restrictions are all emotionally based, as you'll see in this discussion later. But at this point, for many of us, we look at this whole definition of narrow is the gate and cramped the road, and already we have a lot of negative connotations that we're putting on those two words, do we not? We think narrow means we won't have freedom, cramped means we won't have freedom. We automatically have a feeling of wanting to rebel, doing it our own way. The narrow gate is the gate of God reliance. Trust and faith in God. The broad way is self-reliance. The only person we have trust and faith in is ourselves, if we ever do even have trust in ourselves. Right? And these are the two gates that we have the choice of entering or not entering. Now, the reason why I called them a gate was because there was a transition that needed to happen to enter a gate. There has to be an event that occurs opening a gate. Something that you do to make a transition from one way to the other way. And for many of you, you've been hearing the definition of the two gates, you've been looking at all of the different talks and everything, but you're yet to actually physically make the transition from the broad gate into the narrow gate. Because there's something that has to happen emotionally inside of yourself before that transition is actually made. Does that make sense to everyone? There's an emotional adjustment that needs to be made. And what we would like to do today is talk to you about that emotional adjustment that needs to be made. It relates to the three basic principles of what you've been calling the divine love path or the way to God. Do you remember what those three basic principles are? Maybe if we could use the mics and we just one by one. So Jen, right up the back, if we go right up there. If you leave your hand up, Jen, for the Deidre.
Love, truth and humility. So embracing love, embracing truth and having a willingness to feel all of your emotions.
Okay, now let's just maybe be a bit more tight with our definition, shall we, about that. So if we just go in front of you to Cheryl.
Passionate longing for God's truth.
Well, let's start with what Jen started with. She said love, truth and humility. Let's look at love first. What would it be with love? What kind of love are we referring to?
God's love.
God's love. So firstly, we're not just talking about love generally, we're talking about the reception into the soul of divine love, God's love actually entering our soul. So number one is a passionate, longing or desire for God's love to enter and transform our soul. Does that sound all right? Now, I've added this and transform. Why? Because the reality is if our soul isn't being transformed, then it's highly unlikely we're receiving divine love. Does that make sense? If our soul or our nature, our intrinsic nature isn't being transformed, and it's not an automatic thing that's happening, we've got to try hard to do this and try hard to do that and try hard to do this, then it means that God's love is actually yet to enter our soul or has only entered our soul in a little drips here and there. Not enough to actually fully transform our soul into a new being. Because remember, eventually it's going to transform our soul into the divine angel, into that at-one-ment condition with God, the eighth dimension condition. Eventually that's what it's got to do. And for that to happen, there's got to be a transformation. There's got to be some kind of outward demonstration that our soul is changing and that it's changing towards more love, not towards more anger or resentment or other emotions. That it's actually changing towards more love. So that's the first part of the way, isn't it? That's the first part of becoming at one with God, our relationship with God. What was our second part? It's to do with truth. How would we define that, do you think? How would we define the part about truth if we were more specific? Any of you, Matthew, if we bring the mic down? Yep.
I kind of feel pretty well almost exactly what you've got written above, except for substitute God's truth instead of God's love.
Yes. What would God's truth do, though? What kind of action would God's truth have upon our soul, do you feel? Ange? Yep.
Open us to God's love.
It opens us to God's love, yes. So the truth has the effect of actually pulling open the soul so that love can enter it.
Yeah.
So can you see there is a different operation of truth compared to love? Love has the effect of transforming the soul into a new creature, but truth has the effect of opening the soul ready to transform. Does that make sense? That's the different effect that truth has, if we choose to have it that way. So we could say very similar words as you mentioned, Matthew. So if you're right, passionate, longing, or desire for whose truth? God's truth, not our own, God's truth, to what words would we use now? We've got to have the truth enter our soul, don't we? So we do want it to enter our soul. So enter and open our soul to love, to God's love in specific. So truth would have this effect of opening the soul. Now, many of you have experienced that with God's external truths already, right? Where you hear one of God's external truths, such as the law of cause and effect, like we had the discussion last time about, and your soul felt more open to God as a result of hearing that truth. Was that not the case? You have that, it has that effect on us. And that's the beauty of truth, is that the truth has to really have an effect though, the truth has to enter us emotionally, not just intellectually. So truth is very interesting and it has multiple operations upon our soul and our mind. Truth allows our mind to no longer be closed, but even if our mind is open, it doesn't mean that our soul is open. Truth also has the effect of opening our soul as well. It allows our mind to open from being closed, and it also is the operational thing upon our soul that allows our soul to be open rather than closed. And we need both to occur before we will actually know the truth. Now, many of us believe we know the truth. So if I say, what is the truth about the law of attraction? Many of you could probably speak about it for maybe, 10, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour. After 4 hours, many of you would probably be exhausted on the subject, perhaps. But the law of attraction is so fascinating. You could speak about it for days, really, if you really knew it in your soul. But for the majority of us, we don't really know it yet in our soul. We only know it in our mind. So the truth has had the effect of opening our mind, but for many, still yet to have the effect of opening our soul. And that is an emotional process. It's not an intellectual one. So the truth, to have a passionate longing for or desire, you can see there is that our emotions have to be involved with the truth. So what we're going to do today is talk more about signs that that's actually occurring in our life. Does that make sense? That signs that we are actually in this passionate longing or desire for the truth, rather than just intellectually analysing, think that's a nice way of thinking about it, it's great, but then we go on in our lives in the same manner or a similar manner than we always have. That's an indication that the truth is yet really to hit us here in our heart. Because once the truth hits you in your heart, you'll never be able to continue the same action again, ever. Anto?
AJ, what actually happens in your soul with the error when God's love? How does it transform the error itself, or does the error leave you?
No, this is the third aspect of our situation. The error can't leave us unless we have the third thing in operation. Truth doesn't have the effect of forcing the error out of us, and love can only enter us once the error has gone. So there needs to be a third component that allows the error to leave. What's the third component? It's humility. So to be humble. What does to be humble mean? It means to have a passionate, longing or desire to feel every belief and emotion within ourselves whether it is painful or pleasurable. Many of us have just as much problem with pleasure as we do with pain. Right? No matter what anybody else feels about it. A lot of us are all right with the first bit, or semi all right with the first bit, but when it comes to this, no matter what anybody else thinks about it, then we just throw up our hands because we're constantly worried about what everybody else thinks of it. But let's add to it in a different colour. I just wanted to add, it means to see ourselves emotionally as God sees us. So in other words, once we were truly humble, we would have exactly the same opinion of ourselves as God has of us. On every subject. So anything personal that you could ever think of, we would eventually, if we were truly humble, we'd get to the point where we see absolutely everything about ourselves the way God sees it. And to be frank with you, most of us have a terrible opinion of ourselves, right? An opinion of ourselves that is like, when we compare it with God's opinion of us, like God sees us as the pinnacle of his creation, and we see ourselves as the dirt of his creation. That's how much different it is for many of us. We see this huge gap between how we see ourselves and how God sees us. Or conversely, some of us see ourselves as this brilliant individual when God sees a lot of this darkness that's inside of our soul that we're just in total ignorance of. And it means to see ourselves emotionally, not just intellectually. So it's not like going in the mirror and saying, yeah, you've got a bit of a wart on your face there. I wonder what that is about. It's not like seeing yourself physically. It's actually feeling the condition that you see inside of yourself, which is very, very different than intellectually analysing the condition. Right? Now, that is a basic description of the way. And let's summarise what each thing does. God's love enters and transforms our soul. God's truth opens our soul ready to be transformed, and our own humility allows the error to leave. Can you see the relationship between each thing? So this one transforms our soul, this one opens our soul ready for the transformation if we allow it, but this one prevents or allows, depending on our openness to humility, prevents or allows the error to leave. Right? And even the truth to be accepted as well, of course, as a part of that, both things it allows. So you could say that a lot about the gate, if you like, is about this quality of humility. Can you see that? Entering the gate means entering this quality of humility. And for many of us, we're still struggling with that quality of humility because it's not an intellectual place. It's an emotional place. It's not a place that you can make out you have in your mind. It's a place you either have or have not, depending on your condition in your soul. And so what we've got to do is look at these qualities. Each one of them, we'll look at each one of these things in terms of what they do. Now, I've often said to you that the path to God or the way to God is very easy to understand. It's simple to understand. But it's not easy to follow. Otherwise, I wouldn't have called it the narrow gate and cramped is the way leading to life. Can you see? So it's not going to be easy to follow, but it is simple to understand. The broad path leading off to the soul's destruction in most cases, or to the soul's stagnation in others, that path is often very complex and complicated. So it's not simple to understand, but it seems to be easier to do. And that's why we embrace it. That's why most of humanity embraces it. So you know how humanity has created religion after religion after religion after religion, and I think now there's something like 7.5 thousand religions on the planet, and I think there's something like 20 or 30 primary religions on the planet, and 7,500 other religious forms on the planet. The reason why we create all of those things is because we're all trying to invent a way we get to God because we don't want to accept God's way. That's why we do it. Huh? And that way we invent ranges from atheism to agnosticism right the way through to being a devout Catholic or Buddhist or Muslim. All the way through that range is all the way man has invented in order to understand his presence in the universe but it's still not God's way. To be humble means that we are going to at some point accept God's way in our emotional condition. In other words, we're no longer focused on just defining our way by ourselves or making sure that we feel our own way as truth, but rather we now feel God's way is truth. Does that make sense? There's a big difference between those two states. So, is everyone okay with the basics of the way? You've heard them many times, yes, for many of you. And if you haven't, there's a whole introductory pack of DVDs up the back there you can take with you, which will basically present those three things: the longing for divine love, the longing for divine truth, and humility as the different parts of the way. Rita.
I have problems with understanding. It means to see ourselves emotionally as God sees us. So how does God see us? Can you say 10 different...
The problem with me telling you about how God sees you is you will still absorb it as an intellectual argument rather than actually feeling it.
Okay.
Right? To actually make this transition, we've got to start feeling how God sees us. And when we start feeling how God sees us, we don't ask questions about it of other people because we can now feel it.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
But there's also something like God sees us warts and all.
Yes? So how does God view your error?
How does God view my error?
Yeah. So he sees error within all of us. How does he view this error? How do you think he views the error?
As something I can be repentant about it?
No, let's look at how he sees it. I'll just swap this around. Let's look at how he sees it rather than what you've got to do about it. Because you just told me what you think you've got to do about it rather than how God sees it. So what I'll do is I don't know, can I do that? It's just a bit stiff. I'll have to undo that to do that. It's easier to do this. It's a good question, Rita. Right? But let's look at the answer to it. How does God see us? So how does God
I want to
see your error?
I want to say on the natural love path, I had all those beautiful things, how I am and who I am, and it was really uplifting. And
I agree with all that. So God sees the beautiful creature that you are, yeah. But when you get angry with others, does God think it's beautiful?
No.
Okay, so you see,
well, on the natural love path, I completely overlooked it. I didn't even notice it was there.
You see what the natural love path does? Because it's our definition of ourselves that we're seeking on the natural love path, what we do is we only look at the good things, generally. We look at the bad things for other people, but for ourselves we only look at the good things. That's how we treat things with the natural love path. God does see us as a beautiful creature, but how does he see the anger in us? What does he feel about the anger that's within you? Can you tell me? Can you see? You can't tell me.
I am distancing myself from him as soon as I am angry.
So what does God feel about that?
I'm not sure if he feels sad.
Well, no, you're now guessing.
Yeah.
Because you don't feel what God feels about it.
Yeah.
Can you see? And this is the problem we have, is that we don't actually feel what God feels about things. We try to guess what God feels. And that's a big part of our problem. Because we're guessing, but we don't actually believe it. So let's look at there's a difference between what we feel about that question and what we think about that question. Now, what do you think about that question? Well, how does God feel about your anger? Let's put that as the topic. How does God feel about your anger? We think that God feels what? What do you think God might feel?
Distant.
God feels distant, you think? Okay. Just write down anything you feel God feels.
I never thought about how God feels.
Exactly. A lot of times we don't need to think about it because it's impossible to actually think about what somebody feels. You have to actually feel what somebody feels to know. But we often think things. So we often think that God gets angry with us for being angry, which is a bit hypocritical when you think about it. But anyway, we often believe that, do we not, as human race? We feel that God feels... Sorry? What was that? Disappointed is a good one, yeah. Disappointed. Yep. Well, see, yeah, some of us think that God feels compassion. Notice some of these are very different to others. Can you see when we think, we are not very logical? The irony is that we pride ourselves with using our mind to be logical, but can you see, we think, wow, there's quite a few different things, I think, some of which are completely opposites to each other. And the reason why we have to use our mind to sort all this out is because we do not know what God feels about us when we're angry. Can you see that? If we knew what God feels about us, we'd actually feel it every time we're angry, because we can communicate with God through our feelings, so we would know.
So does God feel love for us when we are angry?
Yes, God does feel love for us.
So if I then feel annoyed about myself because I have noticed my anger.
So when you feel angry with yourself for being angry, which many of you do feel, you get really annoyed that you're actually angry, you are out of harmony with how God feels about you when you're angry. Can you see that? And in that place, you're not being humble. By our definition of humility being we emotionally feel what God feels about us at any point in time, we are not humble in that place. When we're angry with ourselves about being angry, or angry with ourselves that we were unsuccessful, or angry with ourselves, God doesn't feel that. God feels love, compassion, kindness, understanding. These are the emotions God has when you're angry, which is the opposite of what we often think God has. Gary?
Does God feel a withdrawal of love from us when we're angry?
No, that's what we think here. So we write that in what we think. Withdraw love. Withdraws love. Can you see how these are the things often that aside from that one, these are the things often that our parents react when we're angry? Can you see that? And so we think God's going to act in the same manner as our parents, or then somebody comes along like AJ and has a talk to you about God and God's feelings about you. And so we talk about the feelings God actually has, these ones. And so then when I ask you the question, what do you feel God feels when you're angry? You then ream those off of your mind, which is the only part of you that these things have entered. It's like going to a school, learning things by memory, and then when you're asked a question, saying it all back, regurgitating it. That's how we are so loose to learning on the planet, is it not? Many of you got your university degrees by doing exactly that. Reading some books, listening to some lectures, writing some things down, and then regurgitating it when there was a need for it to come back. And how good you were at regurgitating it made you get a distinction compared to a pass or a fail. Right? Give up regurgitation. Nothing ever tastes good regurgitated. Haven't you noticed that? You're basically eating somebody else's or your own vomit. That's what regurgitation is it not? Let's be frank about regurgitation. We've got to stop regurgitating. Even what you hear from me needs to be stop regurgitating it. Stop parroting it as if we understand. We either feel it or we do not feel it. So we could say, well, You know, Jesus told me that God feels love, compassion, kindness, and understanding when I'm angry, that God feels those feelings for me. That's what Jesus told me. I don't believe a word of what he's saying. I feel what God feels is distant, angry, disappointed, and withdraws her love as a result of me getting angry. In other words, God punishes me when I get angry. That's what I feel. It's really immaterial what we think. The material point is what we feel. Gary?
I meant, does God feel a withdrawal of love from us when we're angry?
On the opposite end? Yes,
Yeah.
certainly. Whenever we're angry, we automatically withdraw love from all people, not just from God. So God certainly feels no love coming from us in that moment. Certainly. Is God upset about that? No. God has compassion, kindness, and understanding about that. Does it make sense? But certainly every single time we are angry or in fear, we withdraw love from every single thing in our environment in that moment. Love is no longer present. This is the main cause of many of our personal emotional injuries as children. Every time our parents were angry or afraid, we no longer felt loved in that moment. And because we no longer felt loved in that moment, we were confused. And often our parents then said to us, or chose to demonstrate to us through our or their actions, that we actually were at fault for that particular thing, that we were the person to blame for the withdrawal of love in that moment. And so we were often even blamed or punished for them withdrawing love from us. And so we even believe God does that as a result. If we go to Jen up the back there, just in blue. Yep.
So when I'm angry, I still need to feel and experience that anger so
Yes.
that I can get down to the next part of it.
Certainly.
But I also need to be loving, kind, compassionate, and understanding
Of yourself.
of myself, that I need to go through this so that I can become a better person and open myself up more to
Yes.
God.
Yes. It doesn't mean to dump it on everybody else, but understand that every time you're angry, which is already in a way a dumping on other people anyway, so you're already doing it, we need to understand that God feels these things, and eventually we will actually feel the same way about ourselves as God feels about our anger. So you know how many people in different religious denominations around the earth, whether they be Christian or not, they all have this idea that God punishes you for certain actions. That's because they don't feel God. It's because they think of God, and they think that that's what God must be. Because if they felt God, if they actually could feel God's emotions for them, they would realise that in that moment they don't feel anger or disappointment or disapproval or withdrawal of love from God. They only feel things about themselves. You'd be able to tell the difference between those two states. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I know I am still very angry. When you said earlier about all the religions that have led us away from the way of God,
Yep.
I feel very angry with God because, you know, I've had all these teachings from everybody else, and to me it's like this God's way didn't work, and I'm being punished for all the sins of the past generations.
But can you see then how your anger with God is almost illogical? While it's something you need to feel, it is almost illogical in the sense that God never created these other ways. Man did. Man wanted to create man's definition of God. And so man, in his arrogance, decided he'd come up with one way. Let's call it science, or let's call it evolution, or let's call it atheism, or let's call it Christianity, or let's call it, you know, the Muslim faith, or let's call it Hindu or Buddhist, or let's call it, you know, anything that you can think of. that man can pursue, right down to tantric sex as a god. You know, like all sorts of things man creates as a god, and they are all man's way, thinking it's man's way to God. Many of them do believe they are man's way to God. In the case of some of them, like atheism, they don't believe there's a God, so that even takes the whole expression a little further, but it's still the same kind of thing in the sense that it's still a belief system that prevents them from fully embracing themselves and fully embracing their creator. And what we finish up doing with that definition is we create one, and then because we became, like, when I say we, the people who were the leaders of those defining moments decided in their own arrogance that their way was the best way. And in that place, what they decided to do was set up a whole following of that particular way. And this is where literally thousands and thousands of religions got created, by having a following after a person who created a way that he believed was the right way. And of course, he had a whole condition emotionally that caused him to believe that was the right way, which then attracted other people who had the same emotional conditions to believe him. And that's how error, in terms of truth and error, divine truth and error, arrived on the planet. It wasn't God's creation, but rather man's desire to create for himself.
So I'm really angry at the people who went before and changed everything.
Yes.
I'm not really angry at God.
Well, you're unwilling to be angry at the people, and you'd like to blame God for their actions.
Because he's my father figure? Because my father caused some
No, because
No?
you don't want to feel the grief of being told lies most of your life. Do you see? The only reason why we get angry with God is because we don't want to feel the grief of being told lies about God and about other things, about our life, all of our life up to the point that we learn the truth. And God doesn't deserve the rage of that. Who deserves the rage of that is the people who created the untruth. You know, and who deserves, well, like, we have grief as a result of that untruth, and we need to be humble enough to experience that grief. Yeah? That's the creation. Jen, thanks.
Yeshua, where does free will fit into this equation? In an emotional place, does my choices distance me from God? That's not really the question. I'll just ask
Jen,
the first
can I make another statement, which is getting back to the first statement I made to Rita, and that is, if we've got to ask the question where free will fits in, then we are yet to emotionally understand free will. Because once we emotionally understand free will, we will know where it fits in everywhere. Does that make sense to you? Once you actually feel the truth about free will in your heart, you will know where it fits. Now, I'm not saying you have to. I'm just saying we need to firstly grasp this main point, and that is that if we're asking the question, there's a high likelihood that that's telling us we don't yet feel the truth of it. We're still grappling emotionally with the truth of what we're asking the question about. And we are okay to do that from God's perspective. God says, no, that's fine. That's actually a good thing. But we need to understand that we are yet to understand free will in this particular question. So your asking the question demonstrates to me and to anyone who's present and to God and to yourself that you're yet to fully understand free will as a principle, as a loving principle of God's.
It's
Does that
true.
make sense?
It's true.
Yes.
I understand.
And so your question is born out of that lack of understanding emotionally. In other words, what you're trying to do now is intellectually understand free will, right? So that you can hopefully get it to down into here so that you can feel it at some point in the future. And what I'm saying to you is that it's impossible to intellectually understand free will and get it into your soul at the same time using that process of intellectual understanding. There has to be something that happens emotionally that allows the understanding to enter your heart rather than just being an intellectual concept.
It seems like for me that I get into a space where I make the same decisions over and over and over again, and I know that God's there knocking here.
Here.
Yeah,
Yep.
here.
Intellectual knowledge that God is there.
And I seem to keep making, specifically with, say, what you were talking about, anger.
With anger, the same decisions.
Yes.
Yep.
Almost like it's more comfortable for me to make the same decision over and over, or I'm in a state of being conditioned and I'm not sure what else is there. And
No,
it's,
can I just be... You need to be very careful here. The first statement was very correct. You are more comfortable making the decision towards anger than you are to do something in a different direction. Don't go down the state of going, I am conditioned to do so. That is now taking the choice away from you and, to be frank, placing the blame on something external to you.
okay.
Right? The reality is I have anger inside of me, if
Yes.
that's the case, and I often, when I get into the same situation, I am angry in a very similar manner to the last time I was in that same situation. So, for instance, if a situation is the man treats me just with a little bit of condescension, I'm in a rage. Right? So that's the situation.
Yes, that's true.
And then I go and cry and everything else about it, and then the next time the man treats me with condescension, I'm in a rage again.
Yes, I make the same choice and the same result occurs.
Of course.
I go
And
away
then the
and
next
cry,
time...
but it doesn't help.
That's right. And reason why, there must be a reason why it's not helping. And we'll go through that in a minute. But can you see the next time I make the choice and man treats me condescendingly, I get into a rage again. Now, I've done this 3 times in a row now. So that should tell me that what I'm crying about isn't the truth.
But I'm feeling emotional. I'm feeling
I know you're feeling emotional, but that doesn't mean that every emotion in you is the truth. So you can have emotions that are linked with lies inside of you too. Many of us do. Every time you go into a demand of another person, you have an emotion in you that's linked with a lie. And you know what the lie is? Other people have to do what I want. That's the lie. That's the feeling that's inside of us. Every time I go into demand with another person, I'm actually feeling that feeling as a truth. I think that everybody should follow my demands. And that's why I get angry, because they're not following my demands. What's wrong with them? They're not doing what I want. Don't they know that I'm God and not even like God, that I should get everything I want anytime I want it, every time I just have a feeling for it, somebody else should supply it to me. That's the feeling inside of me that I need to release, but we don't. You know what we finish up releasing? We start crying because we're not getting what we want.
So is what you're saying specifically relevant to me, to my emotional journey?
Yes.
So
And
you've-
3/4 of the audience. Yes.
Okay, so
Yep.
you're saying that I have this emotion of demand inside of me.
That you are not releasing.
Okay.
So when a man treats you condescendingly, you have a feeling inside of you, he shouldn't treat me condescendingly. And I put back to you, if you actually understood the law of free will, you would understand at an emotional level that he's allowed to treat you however he wishes.
How then can I exercise my free will?
You don't have to be with him.
That's big.
You can leave him. So that way he doesn't affect you, he affects somebody else. Do you understand?
Can I do it any other way?
Can you see we can understand with our mind what I just said, but put next in the situation where the man treats you condescendingly, I can guarantee to you that you'll go back into anger. And that's because there hasn't been a change happen in the soul. That once the change happens in the soul, when someone treats you condescendingly, you don't go, you don't get all upset about the condescension. You go, wow, he's just treated me condescendingly there. Gee, I have some compassion for that man. He must have had a hard life with his mum and to treat women like that. Or he must have a father who was quite abusive towards women to treat women like that. Should I tell him or not? Yeah, I think I'll tell him that. So you go up to the man, no matter what his condescension is, and you tell him, you must have had a pretty hard life with women, or your father must have been pretty bad towards women. And he gets in a rage with you and says, what are you talking about? You know, and you feel the anger coming at you then. And you go, and if you were at one with the way God feels, you'd go, automatically there would be no rage in you, no resentment in you, nothing like that. There would automatically be a feeling, wow, he's angry at me now. Wow, doesn't that show how resistive he is to dealing with that emotion and how much resistance he has towards that truth? And then if he kept doing it, you'd go, well, do I really want to be with this man? What I'll do is I'll say, look, and if it's a partner, you know, you'd say, look, I really love you, but you don't love me very much. You barely love yourself very much either, because you're getting angry all the time and you treat women condescendingly all the time. So what I need to do, I feel, is I need to withdraw from you for a bit so that you can just feel that on your own, because you're not feeling it when you're with me. But you know, for the majority of you ladies in the audience, you don't do that because you have all these feelings of insecurity that you don't want to feel. And you have all this rage and anger about men's condescension that you don't want to feel, and a whole heap of grief about yourself you don't want to feel when somebody's condescending to you. So you don't do that. What you do instead is you get angry back, because that's the way to handle it. That's the way you've always handled it in the past. That's the way mum might have handled it. And that's what you do. Or it's the feminism way to handle it. You've picked it up from the world and the way it handles things now. None of those things are, all of those things are demonstrating that we have yet to have the truth of free will enter our heart. None of those things indicate anything to do but with the lies that we still believe in our heart. So we can intellectually go, yes, I fully believe in this free will. I should have free will, and we can go on like that. But it's not in our heart yet. And so it cannot transform our life yet. It is only an intellectual concept that we have presented ourselves without, and we still have resistance, obviously, to it entering our heart. Otherwise, there would be a permanent change that we don't have to try to understand.
So is there not a split-second choice where you can choose anger or you can choose something else?
No, that's what the natural love path tells you. And the answer is no. Because once divine love has transformed your soul, you will be unable to be angry. It won't be a choice. It's just impossibility.
Thank you very much.
You can see the reason why we're often faced with choices in our day-to-day lives, and we're told, I have to choose love rather than choosing fear or anger. And the reason why we have to make the choice is because the truth is yet to be in my heart. If the truth was in my heart, there would be no choice. It would be just automatically in love. Does that make sense? Automatically, without any choice being made.
I still don't know how to get there.
But this is the thing. We have discussed the very simple way to get there, Jen. And what I'm saying to you is that we are obviously resistive to that simple way because we're not there yet. So let's go back to the simple way, shall we?
But none of that's simple.
It is simple. What's complicated about that? We're talking about the rest of your eternal life, and I've summarised the rest of your eternal life in terms of internal growth in one page of 3 or 4 simple sentences.
But when you're in a place of such, anger,
Yeah?
that's not simple.
Yes, it is. It's quite simple. You're not being humble.
Black and white.
Yes. Would God get angry in that situation? No.
No.
So if I'm not doing what God would do in that situation, I'm out of harmony with God, am I not?
Yes.
Yes. It's quite simple. Now, if I'm automatically choosing anger, that tells me that in my heart the transformation has yet to occur. So I've got to be honest about it. My heart hasn't accepted the law of free will.
And I must believe that anger is better than this way.
Of course you believe it, otherwise you wouldn't continue doing it. Why would you ever continue doing something
I
unless you
understand.
believed it was right?
I understand.
Of course you wouldn't. So for the majority of us still, we believe anger is the right way. Can you see that? You get a tricky situation, a hard situation, what do? Bend to anger. So you must believe it's the right way. Otherwise, in your heart, you wouldn't be able to even engage anger anymore. It wouldn't even come up in you anymore. And you have to squash it in an interaction. Does that make sense? It wouldn't even come up anymore. Yep. If we go Mary and then Jen, down the front.
I think this is sort of a question or a feeling that I'm grappling with. But on the other side of the board, you had how God feels, what we think God feels and how we feel God feels. And I feel like at times I feel God. And even when I'm angry or resistive or in a state of fear, and I do feel those beautiful things that you wrote, the love and the compassion and a tenderness with me that I feel I lack with myself most of the time.
Yep.
But I also feel another quality within, and I feel it's a quality within love that I haven't understood because of the way I was brought up this time. And it's a sense of constantness. I don't know the right word. It's very it's not harsh.
Yeah.
But it's unyielding in the quality of truth and love, and that is it reflects to me. Yes, my daughter, you're afraid.
Yes.
And that is an error.
Yes.
Yes, you're angry, and that is not right.
Yes.
You know that is not love.
Yeah.
And
So God's not withdrawing love from you in that moment because you can still feel
loved.
God's love.
I feel loved, but I also feel this constancy from God about what love is and how I can connect with Him. And I feel that this is something that prevents me, because of this third element that you're speaking to Jen about, this desire to feel everything within me.
Yep.
Because of that, and I receive that love from God that also gives me this message about what love is. Because of the level of fear within me, it makes me contract away from God again. I feel like, no, I can't feel everything that you're reflecting to me is not loving.
Yeah.
And
But if you flip it over and you actually felt everything that God was reflecting to you, what would you finish up doing?
I would feel all of my fear and terror.
Well,
it
your
would
heart
flow
would
out
burst
of me.
in grief, wouldn't
Yes.
it? Like, just flow out.
Absolute grief. And I know that I would stay in that connection.
Yes.
And so it seems to me, I think I answered my question, but, it seems to me that courage is to stay with truth, the truth that I know, even intellectually, with God, who God's giving me that emotional truth in that moment, to then be with myself.
Certainly.
Yeah.
It takes courage to be humble.
Yeah.
Certainly. And I'm not saying it doesn't, but it is
I
simple.
know. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah.
But you're right, babe. It's like what happens a lot is that we feel the constancy of God's love in a certain situation, and then because of our own condition, we withdraw from God purposefully, because we don't want to feel the error.
I guess I just feel that so strongly that God, I'm not doubting God, and God, when I open myself, I feel all that from God. But I just feel my own lack of courage to stay in that connection. Because of my fear.
Yeah, because of the fear of the error, because of your inability to maintain a painful emotion for any extended period of time. Yeah.
Thanks, babe.
Yeah. Okay. Now, obviously, I've only just introduced this topic at this point. So there's a lot more for us to discuss on each one of these issues, which I would like to do as we go. But is everyone starting to get the understanding that we can talk about the truth and we can think we know the truth, we can think we are doing the truth, and we can think that we're doing the right thing, and at the same time be in complete error on all of those subjects? and not understand that in our soul is where the transformation needs to occur. Divine love, when it enters our soul, will naturally make that transformation. All we've got to do is allow the love to enter us, and the transformation will begin. How do we allow the love to enter us? By being open and having a longing for the truth, which is the thing that opens our soul to love entering us, and being humble, because that's the thing that allows the error to leave us so that the truth can enter us. Can you see? There's just a few basic things there that we keep forgetting in our day-to-day life. So what many of us are trying to do is we're trying to receive God's love without being humble. Or for most of us, we're trying to receive God's love without having a desire for truth or without being humble. That's what we're trying to do. And it's a physical impossibility to do such things. You might as well just give up the path right now if you're going to continue doing that, because it's a physical impossibility for love to enter and transform your soul without you having a longing for truth and without your humility. Can you see? Can you see what we're doing is we're often desiring God's love. We come along to these sessions, we're thinking about God's love, and we're noticing in our lives we keep doing the same pattern of things, but we don't, and we feel all confused about it and distressed about it, and we feel like, oh, this is not getting me anywhere and all those kind of things. But we're not coming face to face with two facts. And that is, I'm just not being humble and I just don't want the truth. And that's why it isn't working. Can you see? We're just off base when it comes to acknowledging the basic principles of the way. That's what we're doing. So what we need to do is to start allowing ourselves, even intellectually at this point, to analyse what's going on. Do you want to spend another 3 or 5 years, or however long you've known about the divine love path, before you make the actual opening of the gate into the narrow way? Well, I don't know about you, but I would think that's a bit of a waste of my time. Right? What we would like to do is actually make the physical transformation into the gate that leads on the narrow path, the way that leads to God. Even though it seems to be narrow and cramped, we still want to get on that path. Now, to get on that path, all three things must be engaged. Now, you don't have to worry about the transformation of your soul, because God's love will do it for you. Do you understand? You don't have to force yourself to change, because God's love will change you. You do need to allow the change to occur using your will. You do need to allow humility and truth to become a part of your being before these transformations will occur, because love cannot enter you without these other things. So we need to go back to this basic understanding that I presented earlier, and that is God's love transforms the soul. You do not have to do it for yourself, because God's love will do it for you. So that's number one. God's love will transform your soul. It's a guaranteed fact that God's love will transform your soul. There are billions of spirits in the celestial kingdom who know that for a fact, because their own soul has been transformed by that love. Right? You do not have to worry about your soul being transformed. You do not have to try to transform your own soul. You don't have to make your own soul transformation yourself. Have I made that point clear? Okay. However, you do need to have an opening for the love to enter in order for the transformation to take place. Can you see the difference? There needs to be an opening inside of yourself that allows the love to transform your soul. You don't have to try to transform your soul. You just need to allow the love to do its work. Now, how do I allow the love to do its work? By being desirous of truth inside of my soul, having a passionate desire in my heart to actually be in truth. And once I'm in that space, and I'm also in this other space of being completely humble to all the error that's in me, so the error can just flow out naturally. As the error is flowing out naturally, I am now, because I'm open to truth and I understand the truth will open my soul now is automatically open, and there's space in it in order for the love to flow. And the love will transform me. As long as I can receive it, the love will transform me. You see, what a lot of us have been doing, even though I've presented these truths to you before, a lot of us have yet to understand them. Can you see? Like, we think we're understanding them, we think, this is what I'm trying to do, right? But we're not understanding that you do not have to try to transform your own soul. You don't have to do that. What we need to do instead is to allow the soul to be transformed, which is a process of being open to truth, which opens our soul, and being humble to our emotions, which allows all the negative crap, all the error, to just leave us naturally. We don't have to try to do it. It will happen naturally if we're completely open and humble. So, many of us have been doing the opposite, haven't we? Can you see that? Who thinks they've been doing the opposite of that? Yeah, quite a few of you. So, because what we've been doing is we're trying to receive God's love, and we're trying to make our soul different so God's love will enter us. Right? God's love transforms the soul. You don't need to try to make things different. And to be honest with you, it's impossible for you to actually make things different without the reception of the transforming power of God's love. So, but what you need to do is be open to its reception. There has to be an openness inside of your own soul to receiving the truth and to allowing these negative emotions that we've picked up along our path, along our way, to leave us so there's space for love to enter us. So if you just continue, remember I've drawn this little diagram and I'll draw it up the top again. It's like we're like a bottle, upended if you like, but we're like a bottle. So just draw a bottle. There's the bottle of our soul. At the moment, for many of us, we have all this emotional experience filled to the very brim. Right? And then for many of us, we also have a very firm cap or cork on the top of that brim because we don't want to let any of it ever out. And then we're longing for divine love. And God's trying to pour the love on this closed bottle that's already full of other things. And then we're going, I've been doing this now for 2 years and nothing's happened. There's been not very many substantial changes in my life. You know, I still have as much problem with my relationship as I had 2 years ago, and I still have as much problem with my friendships as I did then. I still have as much problem with money as I did then. I still have as much problem with happiness as I did then. I still have as much problem creating what I want to create. I still get pretty annoyed and angry every time and frustrated all the time when I don't get what I want. All of the same things that used to happen, happened. Still happening. And then I go, there must be something wrong with this path. There must be something wrong with what I'm hearing. It sounds all right, but must be something wrong. So we leave it for a while and nothing else out there satisfies us, so we come back to it, and then we leave it and we come back to it. And over a period of a few years, we might leave it and come back to it many times. Like Sometimes we feel convinced, sometimes we don't, and so forth. And the problem is, our humility has placed this cap on top of our crap that we don't want to, because we're not humble to experiencing it, we can't release it. And if there's no space in the bottle, so there's not any space in the bottle, there must be, some of this has to be cleared out in the bottle for something to be poured in. And if there's no space in the bottle, the law of physics, and there are laws of physics governing the operation of your soul, the law of physics prevents the love from entering, or anything else for that matter, for entering. And our soul doesn't have the capacity to expand either, to transform as a result. The love entering our soul is like transforming that bottle into an elasticized container that the more you pour in, just the bigger it gets. Right? And that's the effect that the love has on the structure of the soul even. But we don't even worry about any of that because none of the love has entered us for even to have experienced that particular shift. So, what can we do about that? Well, the first thing we need to do, and I want to summarise this again for you so that it's nice and solid, at least in that regurgitating machine you've got going up there, is that God's love transforms your soul. You do not have to transform your own soul. Number one. You just need to be open to God's love entering it. Now, the two things that determine your openness to God's love entering your soul is, number one, your desire and longing for truth. There is this physical, mechanical thing that happens to your soul when you desire truth, in that your soul starts opening. Your heart starts opening to the absorption of love as a result of the openness. The truth is the thing that opens your soul. It makes you more aware of your environment and your life and everything that's going on in it. That's the effect of the truth. It opens you to your true condition and nature. It opens you even to acknowledging the truth of the different emotions that exist within you, of the errors that were pounded into you via your environment. It opens you to that. Does that make sense? Now, it's okay if our soul's open, but if it's full of crap, something has to happen. Now, when it's open and tipped over, it will automatically flow out if we are humble. If we have this desire and passion to actually feel every single belief and emotion that exists within us, rather than just intellectualize everything. If we allow that, no matter what our environment says to do, and no matter what anybody else feels about us doing that. From that moment on, we have a chance, and in fact, if we allow that condition permanently, we will permanently continue to receive divine love, even if it's only at a dribble. But what happens is we ebb and flow. Sometimes we get to a big truth and we go, wow, that's just pretty hard for me to accept. So I don't accept it for a while. Now, of course, my soul is now closed to receiving more of the transformational love from God. So from that moment onwards, I am not going to transform. Now, if I keep that closed for 6 months, then 6 months later, I'll look back on the last 6 months and I'll go, yep, I certainly have not changed on that particular issue. Right? And if I keep it closed for 5 years, then it will be 5 years. And if I keep it closed for 1,000 years, it will be 1,000 years. Simple as that. When I choose to have the opening to the truth, now I have the ability for the love to flow again. Right? Now, I have the ability for the love to flow, but if there is error-based emotion inside of me, or a belief system that is totally opposite to what that truth is saying inside of me, I'm going to have to allow myself to experience some pain in its release. I'm going to need to allow myself to feel the release of that pain, rather than just go, yeah, I've got a lot of pain about how my mum treated me or my dad treated me or this situation or that situation here, and talking about it here without feeling it here. So this is one of the problems we face. We can talk about crap until, as the saying is, the cows come home, until evening, and we go to sleep, and we wake up in the morning and we can open our mouth and talk more about the same crap. But until we actually open our heart in humility and open our heart to the truth, in our heart, not in our head, nothing can be transformed. Nothing. This is the reason why most Christian faiths experience a very short transformational period. Every person who enters that faith enters a very short transformational period in their soul, and then the instant a truth comes up that they do not wish to accept, they close their soul, no more transformation is going to take place. And they'll be stagnant for the rest of their life or potentially existence if they don't make a change. Billions of people in the spirit world in that condition. There are billions in the sixth dimension of the spirit world in that condition, not wanting to accept one particular truth and so therefore completely closed to further change, unable to progress beyond that point. They believe themselves to be happy when the comparison of happiness between the eighth and the sixth dimension is thousands of times better in the eighth than the sixth, but they won't even accept that because they do not want to be open to the truth. Yeah? Yeah. Matt, if we just...
I'm not sure if I'll be able to say this right, but how do people, like when you were saying before that, like, I don't have to change my own soul, how do people go with like the resistance to feeling like we don't, like God loves us so much that she'll actually do that for us?
Well, that is an emotion or a belief.
Right.
So I need to be humble to that belief and feel it.
Okay.
So for example, if I do not believe that God will make the transformation or give me any love, then I need to feel that. I need to have a good cry about the fact that I believe that God will not give me any love. That's a part of being humble. Once I release that pain, this belief that I have that God will not love me because of I'm no good and for some reason I'm worse than any other person on the planet and that's why God won't do it. Once I release those beliefs, or I believe there's no such thing as God, that might be a belief, so I need to release that belief. Once I release the belief emotionally, now it will automatically flow. If I have a longing for it, it will flow automatically.
Exactly.
Does that make sense? So you can see, can't you, that a core part of the principles of divine truth are humility and the truth itself. The love will flow and transform automatically when we have humility and a desire for truth. This is why it's the truth that sets you free, right? Because the truth is what allows the love to enter, and if you're humble about it, it will enter. But it requires deep humility in order for that to occur. So how about we discuss, I've still got a half an hour or so before we have a break, how about we discuss each thing point by point? Does that make sense? So we'll look at this passionate desire for love and the understanding that it transforms us. How about we look at that? And then how about we look at, after that, the longing for truth and the effect that truth has on our soul? And then how about we look thirdly at this aspect of humility again? We just revise this aspect of humility and what it means to be humble and what it does with error, how we actually process through and release this error. within us. So we'll look at those particular three things, all right? So let's do that. Let's start with the first one, which is this passion or desire for God to give us love. Okay. So let's talk about God's love for a bit and its power. When you were first created as a soul, many of you understand that you were created as a whole soul to which there were basically masculine and feminine qualities, and the soul split in two. When the soul splits in two, we split into these two halves and we incarnate on this planet. Now, there can be two male halves and two female halves, as well as that masculine and feminine split, as I've described in other talks. Now, that soul has got a finite capacity to experience life in this moment. What I mean by that is, God has naturally designed this soul, which is really the complete soul that God's designed, and the process of the individualization process. God has designed all of that, but the soul itself, the individual half in this case, has a finite... Do you know what I mean by finite capacity? In other words, it's limited by its design. So, if I can give you an illustration of being limited by design. Many of you have a car, yes? It usually has 4 wheels, yes? And 4 tyres, yes? And it has usually a place where the occupants of the vehicle, varying in number, can sit in relative comfort, depending on the vehicle. It gets you, it has a motor, in other words, some driving force to get you from A to B, does it not? Okay. So it has a finite capacity, the vehicle. Your seating capacity might be 5, let's say, in comfort. When you add 6, what do you find then? It's now uncomfortable for 1 or more passengers. Let's say you tried to put 25 in there. Now, I've seen that happen. Somebody tried to put 25 people in a mini Minor, and I think there is a picture of it on the internet, actually. Now, that is an extreme degree of discomfort, is it not? But it's still possible. But you try to add 150 people to your car. Now it's a physical impossibility. That's what I mean by a finite capacity. Your soul was originally designed in its natural form with a finite capacity. That finite capacity is reached when you enter the 6th dimension or the 6th sphere of the spirit world, or into that same condition while you're on earth, which is possible. You experience from that moment on the finite capacity of the soul without any other external influences. Does that make sense? Now, God has also designed a system where the finite capacity of the soul can be increased. It can be bigger than its original design. It's like having a car that stretches as per the amount of people that you want to put in it. So you imagine that. You've got 25 people over for dinner and you decide you're going to go and pick them all up, and all of a sudden your car's a bus. And you manage to pick them all up, drive them home. Now you don't need your bus anymore, so it goes back to 5 people. And now you only need the car for 1 person, so it's now a 1-person car. And then you want 100 people to go in the car, and it expands to the 100 people, and you can get into all of you can get in comfort in the car. So that's the kind of soul God designed for you. A soul that can expand and grow to further capacity. It no longer has a finite capacity, but the finite capacity, the limited capacity, can now grow. We have an option to grow the soul. To grow the soul has to transform into something else. It can't stay as it was originally designed. If it stays as it's originally designed, it has its limitations. And the limitations are the same limitations as your car, how it was originally designed. Does that make sense? It's got a finite capacity. The method God has used to grow your soul is and this is, by the way, a scientific truth, not just a physical one or a spiritual one. It's a scientific truth that God's love transforms the soul into a different type of thing that can grow beyond its finite capacity. God's love does that. When God's love enters the soul, your soul can now grow beyond its original conception. God's created this ability in the soul itself for it to receive something that actually causes it to transform into an elasticized creature, something that can grow and have larger possibilities and potentials. That's what divine love does. That's the operation of divine love on your soul. Can you see that it's impossible for you to transform your soul? Because if you try to do it by yourself without God's love entering your soul, you can never go beyond your original finite capacity, which is the sixth dimension. You cannot grow beyond the sixth sphere, the sixth dimension in the spirit world, or on earth you can reach this state, remember. You cannot grow beyond that because that is the finite capacity that God originally designed in the soul. Just like your car, when you bought it, had a finite capacity that was originally created by its designers. Exactly the same principle. Nothing can occur, nothing can get better than that. And that's why when you buy your car, the very first day you drive that home, that's the best time you're ever going to have in your car. Probably. Because it cannot grow beyond that. It cannot change beyond that. But God designed your soul to receive something that could change it and enable it to grow beyond that. And that is God's love. That's the importance of God's love to your life. Right? So, my suggestion to you is this, with regard to understanding the transformational effect of God's love. Give up trying to transform your own soul. Many of you have yet to give this up. Many of you think if you try harder, you do more effort here, do more effort there. If you try harder here, try harder there, you try to be good, something's going to change. It's not going to change beyond its original finite capacity. It might change from beyond where you are, but it won't change beyond the original finite capacity, that six-sphere capacity. It can't change. It cannot change, in fact, without the reception of God's love. It cannot change. Right? So give it up. Give up the personal desire to be personally responsible for the transformation of your own soul, because you can't do it. You will not ever enter the seventh dimension of the spirit world, either on earth or in heaven. You will not enter that state until you give up the thought that you can transform your own soul. Because you can't. You can't do it. So what would a person who really understands the divine love path do? If you really got it in your heart.
I'll be praying for a greater desire for God's love to enter and transform.
Awesome, yes. We can actually improve our desire for it, can't we? That is something we can change, because that's something under our control. That's under our control. That and that are under our control. We can be passionate, longing, desirous. That's all under our control. We can long for the thing, the substance that transforms us. That is under our control. right up the back. I think it's D.
Thanks, Andrew. AJ, when we pray for a stronger desire,
Yep.
does that desire, when our desire gets stronger, is that an intellectual desire or is it?
Well, firstly, can God give you more desire?
I want to say no, it's mine.
Well, I'd agree with you. God can't give you more desire. When your soul transforms into a new, bigger thing, it might have more desire then, but God's not actually giving you more desire right at that moment before it happens. Does that make sense? So when you pray for an improved desire, how effective is this prayer? Have you found it effective in the past? How many of you have found the prayer for more desire effective? Yeah? Why would it be effective for you? Ange, thanks. For you have the mic.
Because we open ourselves up to more truth.
Yeah, see, what we're doing is we're saying to ourselves, I realise that I need to have a stronger desire inside of myself. And this is a basic truth. It's called the truth of the law of desire. The truth of the law of desire is if I have a stronger desire, I'll have a stronger effect. And that is the basic truth of that law. So I realise that if I just sit on my, what's the saying? Go. Sorry? Laurels, is it? Oh, I have a more crass way probably of saying it than most of you. If I just sit on my backside, expecting things to come to me without exercising a desire, will things ever come to me? Will you try it? Like, my suggestion, if you believe that is occurring, see, the problem is that many of us do believe that should occur with love and spiritual truth. But the reality is, for all of us, we all understand that it doesn't occur with physical things. So you try it with physical things, what happens? You sit on your backside whole of next week. You don't go anywhere. You just couch potato. And see whether somebody feeds you. Now, unfortunately, for some of you, somebody might feed you. And that's a bit of a shame for both you and the person who's doing that. But for the majority of you, you will find that you will not get fed. And particularly if you're by yourself, you will definitely not get fed. You'll sit there, and after 2 days, you'll probably start feeling really hungry. For most of us, it might be after 4 or 5 hours, right? And you'd start feeling really thirsty. And actually, after 5 days, you could be in very serious trouble if you didn't have a drink or two, at least, in that time. You could be in very serious trouble. Only 5 days. 5 days not having a desire to feed yourself, and you can almost be dead if you also don't drink, right? And if you keep on going without any water, within a few weeks, it's highly unlikely that the parts of your whole body will start closing down and causing major drama to your entire body, yes? So all of you have learned through your personal experience that if you're hungry, you better do something about it. And if you're thirsty, you've got to do something about it. Is that not true? You're driven by a desire to feed yourself, yes? Okay. And yet, we have this belief with God's love that we should be able to just sit on our backside and do nothing, and it should all just come to me. That's what we believe. We believe what is not in actual fact happening in any physical sense in the universe, and yet we believe it should happen in a spiritual condition. How logical is that? If it's not happening in your day-to-day life with other things, it's highly unlikely that sitting on your backside without doing anything is going to have an effect with your relationship with God either. Can you see that? And that's partly the law of desire. There's a law that governs that. If you desire something passionately, it will come to you, is how. But to desire something passionately, do you sit on your backside? Definitely not. You take affirmative action to getting it, do you not? And you don't wait until everybody else gives it to you. You take action for yourself, do you not? And that's something we need to do with God's love. Same principle. Igor?
AJ, with taking personal, this is what you're talking about, taking personal responsibility and desire to look after yourself, and I can see it slipping into self-reliance very, very quickly.
There's a difference between personal responsibility and self-reliance.
So where do we draw a line between God-reliance and self-reliance?
Well, God's love transforms our soul. If I understand that at the soul level, I will not be attempting to transform my own soul. If I am, I'm being self-reliant. How many of you are being self-reliant? Almost all of you at this point. Because you have been trying to transform your own soul. That's self-reliance.
So how do we let go of that?
So how do you let go of that? You have to come to some kind of emotional understanding, not an intellectual one, that God's love transforms your soul. There has to be these qualities that we've talked about many times before of faith, trust, not in yourself, but in God. That God has made this beautiful system where you do not have to transform your own soul. God's love can do it for you as long as you do a few things that are to do with your will, that are to do with the expression of your desire. Does that make sense? So I see people trying to transform, they think they're being humble. People trying to transform their own soul are not being humble. Because it actually is against one basic truth of the universe, and that is that God's love transforms your soul. Nothing else can. There's physically nothing else that can transform it. So only God's love can. So every time I am trying to transform my own soul by some kind of physical, emotional or spiritual effort, I am actually in self-reliance, and I'm not having faith and trust in God because I'm in self-reliance. I'm actually thinking I'm doing it. And I can't. There's a physical impossibility because it's only God's love that transforms the soul. I can't transform my own soul. Beyond that sixth dimensional condition, I cannot transform it. So to me, we often have different definition of self-reliance, you see. A lot of people are saying that they have God-reliance, but they don't yet, in their heart, accept this one truth that actually there's nothing I can do to transform my soul. Nothing I can do to transform my soul, because God's love is the thing that transforms it. All I can do is either receive God's love or reject it. That's all I can do. So I can use my will to receive or reject God's love, but it's God's love that does the transformation. Behind you, Matt.
So is there a bit of a difference then with transforming a God's love, transforming my soul compared to growing in love? Is it a very different thing?
You can personally grow in love, but only to the sixth dimension.
Right.
That is the extent or the limitation of your original design.
Yeah.
So you can, and many do, and let's face it, most of the earth is in this place. Every religion is in this place pretty much on the planet at the moment, where they are trying to be good, trying to be more loving, trying to be more this, trying to be more that. And the reason why they're trying is because God's love isn't transforming their soul because they're not receiving it. So they have to try. But the truth is you can try to become more loving, but only to the pinnacle of your own existence. The finite ability that God originally gave you was to be in the sixth dimension with regard to your love.
Okay.
That's the limit of your development. So you can do it to that limit, but that is a finite limit that cannot be increased without God's love entering your soul.
So transforming my soul is something just completely different to that then, is it?
Allowing God's love to transform your soul is something completely different to that.
Yes.
The whole natural love path is all about transforming your own soul, attempting the process.
And yet no one's ever done it.
No one's ever done it fully on earth, but millions, billions of people have done it in the spirit world, have transformed their own soul to the sixth dimension, to their original finite condition,
Capacity, okay.
limitation.
Yeah.
Billions of people have done that. Billions of people are still doing it in the spirit world and on earth.
Yeah.
Yes? Yeah. But what I'm saying to you is that to actually transform your soul requires something further than that. To actually develop your soul beyond that condition requires the transformation of the soul itself.
Yeah.
It's like the soul turning. You know this old... Myself and Mary, when we went up to Cairns, we went to a butterfly house, the butterfly house up at Corunda. Has anybody been there? It's really lovely there, isn't it? It always has an emotional effect on us, myself and Mary, the first time we enter the place. So Mary spent most of the time crying in the butterfly house this time, just like I did the first time I entered it. But there we have a caterpillar, right, with his... right? Merrily munching away on life. He grows to his finite capacity. In the case of, is it the monarch moth? It's a pretty big capacity. No, the Hercules moth, pretty big capacity. We had one of the grubs in our backyard of a Hercules moth, and no joke, he was about so long and about that thick by the time he stopped eating. Right? But stop eating he did because he could not grow beyond that capacity. And he could never become the moth. He could never fly. He could never do things that the grub is not able to do. You understand? Then he had to go through a pupating stage, or what do you call it, chrysalis stage. Let's draw it for him. For him, it's a stage where he's wrapped up in leaves and stuff like that, and sitting there for... He might sit like that. Potentially the Hercules moth can sit like that for years, up to 3 or 4 years. And do you know what happens inside of it? It completely disintegrates and goes to a liquid. It doesn't have a skin anymore, it doesn't have the structure anymore. Inside of that, it goes to a liquid completely. Every butterfly does this. Every caterpillar does this, turning into a butterfly. And then, due to a chain of events, in the case of this moth, if there's a big rain, generally, it then comes out of its chrysalis state and into the huge moth that it is. Not quite that big in the case of Hercules, but close. It's about that big, right, for that particular moth. Giant moth. Now, in this state, it has the ability to fly. It has the ability to experience far more things. It actually even eats different things. Did you know that? The grub eats leaves. What does the...
Nectar.
Nectar. It's very different. It even eats different. Everything's different. Now, God's love, if it's not received, will only ever allow you to be the biggest possible grub you could ever be. That's it. This transformational effect of the chrysalis, in this case inside of your soul, can only occur by the grub deciding to receive God's love. That's the only thing that can occur. Without it doing this transformation, it is impossible for it to ever become the angel God designed for us to become. And I don't use that in a, like this holier than thou thing, a way, but rather it's a complete transformation from the original possibilities.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Exactly the same. Mary, you want to add? And then there was someone, Alex, up the back.
To me, that's the difference between self-reliance and God-reliance. For me, what I feel like I'm coming up against constantly lately is how much I want to be the best scrub I can be, and there's no trust in me.
You want to define that place, yeah.
I want to define it and I want to master it, and it's all about me, making me good.
Yep.
And why I find this whole process so moving is because of the trust involved in becoming the chrysalis and completely dissolving every conception of what I think a good me is, so that God can create this me that's just far above and beyond anything I could conceive of as the grub. And for me, that is the difference between self-reliance is like, I'm a grub and I can be a good grub and I know what a good grub looks like. Yeah. But that grub can't even imagine the butterfly. And the
also,
God reliance is in the chrysalis of the sweaty, dissolving part of, I don't know what's going to happen next.
Yes. And that is the key part, isn't it? Yeah. Like you said. And that's, when we were discussing up there, that's what we felt each time. Just like for myself and Mary, when we went into the butterfly house, this is what we felt the most, was the trust and faith involved in that process. The grub trusts completely that if it completely dissolves into a liquid, it's going to come out something different at the end.
It can't hold on and go, hang on, I'm losing a leg. Yeah. It just has
another
to let
leg
go.
gone, another arm gone, another one bites the dust. Yeah. Yep. Does that make sense to everyone? This is what we need to understand about God's love, you see. You see, what we're trying to do, most of us are trying to do our own transformation. We try and we try and we try and try. And you can continue doing that if you like, but you are still on the natural love path. You're still on it. That's what we do on the natural love path. We try and try and try until we reach the pinnacle of our original creation, which is the limitation, the finite limitation of that sixth dimension. And that's it. That's the full extent that we're ever going to go after that, while we continue to do the same thing. Yes? To do this requires something different happening. It requires some physical transformation to occur that shifts us from just trying to be the best we can be into being what God created us to be. Yeah?
And it feels like, to me, there has to be an acknowledgement of the truth of God in that I am God's creation and not my own.
Not my own.
And that, I think, the injury of self-reliance screams about that, because it feels like no control.
Yeah.
And yet it's the most beautiful thing that we can end up acknowledging, because someone much more powerful, loving, creative than this finite soul put
and
an
intelligent,
imprint,
I would add to that.
yes, put an imprint inside of me that is going to make me something beyond what I can imagine, but only if I acknowledge him in that process.
Only if I engage the process.
And acknowledge his creation is me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to actually have a pure longing for God's love requires, can you see, quite a number of emotional shifts in our awareness. It requires us to see the difference between self-reliance and God-reliance. It requires us also to be humble to the release of emotion so that love can enter us, and it requires that we have an openness to truth. But what we need to also have is some faith and trust that this condition can be reached. And to have faith and trust requires releasing a lot of false beliefs about our parents and what a parent was and what our definition of a parent. Can you see that? If our definition of a parent is someone who's never going to love us unless we try hard, can you see we're on the natural love path still? Because that's not how God is. God's loving us if you try not at all. And in fact, you can't try to transform your soul. You can only do things that prevent the transformation of your soul. You can't try to transform it because you have limitations, personal limitations, every single one of us. Does everyone get the principle of that first step? Isn't it interesting how you can listen to truths about divine love for 2, 3, 4 years and it not dawn on you some very basic things? You find that fascinating sometimes? How some very basic things don't dawn with you. They don't actually settle inside of you emotionally until much, much later sometimes in the process. I just find that remarkable at times because you can see that words lack power, don't they? Like many of these words I've said to you before, but they lack power and they can't have power. Words are like that. It's only emotions and feelings that can eventually have the power that we need. You look at your life, you can't enjoy your life with your intellect. You will enjoy your life when you feel enjoyment of your life. And sometimes that might be enjoying your intellect, emotionally enjoying your intellect, but we need to emotionally engage our life. So this is a basic thing that I'd like you to consider before we go to our break, is just this basic, and while you're in the break perhaps, this basic principle that we cannot transform our own soul. We must receive divine love if we wish our soul to transform beyond its original capacity. Yep. And then after the break, what we'll do is we'll spend an hour of each discussing these truths about truth and humility. Does that make sense? Just before we go, is there a question? Yeah. Mike, where is the mic at the moment? Sorry, Alex. I asked you. Yeah, sorry, mate. Let's go with you first. Sorry, mate.
I have a feeling, I'm sure it's in error, but I'd like to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
I feel like God allows the facade of people to believe that they're in a better space than what they really are in being allowed to go to the sixth sphere.
When you say God allows the facade, well, God allows everything to occur potentially if we use our will, but God doesn't accept the facade ever.
So why are they allowed to get to the sixth sphere? Why don't they get to the third sphere and say, well, you haven't learnt these basic things, you're not allowed to go any further?
Well, to learn everything to go higher requires a transformation in the soul, and you're allowed to choose to not make that transformation. So you're allowed to get to the sixth dimension and not make a transformation. That's what God has originally allowed in your original design.
I think it's spirit-driven, this question.
Yep.
Because I feel like most of them in the sixth sphere are actually, they're not wanting to go backwards because they're so entrenched in the facade.
Yes, and that's their choice.
Believing that they're in a good state, which they have been allowed to progress to.
I'm not saying they're in a bad state, because the reality is in the sixth sphere state, you are being the best that you were originally created to be. That's the reality of the sixth dimensional state. You are being the best that God originally put as your finite condition or capacity. And the sixth sphere state is the best of that state. So it's not the worst, like it's the best you can be without actually engaging a different process. What I am suggesting is that if you engage a different process, you now can progress beyond that state into additional further states, but only by learning some very basic principles that you could have learnt when you're in the third dimensional of your existence, but you chose not to. Now, for our sixth sphere spirit friends, I'm not saying to them that that state isn't a beautiful state, because it is a beautiful state. It's the best state you could possibly be without engaging this other process. So it's what God designed in you to be if you chose to not engage this other process. It's the best you can be by developing yourself. But what I am saying is for most sixth sphere spirits and most spirits on that natural love path, they have a certain arrogance and pride that they personally achieved that state by themselves, which, by the way, they did do. Because it's only God's love that can transform their soul beyond that state, and they need God to do that transformation beyond that state. But they did accomplish their sixth sphere development by their own effort, and I acknowledge their effort. However, I'm saying there is a limit to how far they can go with their own effort. That's all I'm saying.
They're very reluctant to step backwards. They feel they're being punished.
No, they're not being punished because remember they made the choice to skip over some basic principles in the third dimension and the fifth dimension that they could have learned more about the transformational effect of God's love, and they would have not had to try as hard. What the problem is they've become addicted to their own arrogance, their own feelings about themselves and what they've created, and they're going to need to let that go. And the letting go of that occurs in the third dimension on the divine love path, on the way. And so they will need to revisit that dimension. They will need to revisit that condition in order to do that. However, they can go back to the sixth dimension at any time they wish. So they're not being punished. It's a choice they will need to make. A choice to start allowing God's love to transform their soul rather than believing they can progress further without God's love entering them. Does that make sense to them, Alex?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back and clarify on the prayer for desire, because I didn't feel the clarity on that. I have not been under the impression that I could pray for more desire and have that response from God, whereas I can pray for more emotional truth or something like that. So I just wanted to sort of wrap that.
I feel it would be more accurate to pray for a development of desire rather than actually pray for desire. The reality is that God will not give you desire. You need to develop it within yourself. But God can help show you how to develop it within yourself. The primary way in which to develop desire for yourself is to release fear. Fear will always control desire if it is present. So what we would need to do, if we were praying for desire, it would be more accurate to actually pray for the release or the help to release fear. Fear is what prevents all desire. So let me give an example. Many women, by the time they reach their 40s, feel very little desire for sex. And what I'm saying in this particular principle is that actually fear is the problem, not to pray for desire to have more sex, but rather to release the fear they have about sex. Now, for many women, the fear that they have about sex, for example, is a fear that if they give their heart completely open to a male in particular, that the male will use and abuse them. And so they try to maintain a closed heart while they're engaged in sexual activity. That causes them to eventually have no desire for sex as a result. So in this case, the example I'm giving, fear is preventing a desire from being present. So when we pray for a desire, we would probably in most cases it would be more advisable to pray for the release of fear that prevents the desire. Does that make sense to everyone? You see, it's fear that prevents most of our desires. So, if we have no desire for God's love to enter us, there can only be fear stopping the desire. Does that make sense to everyone? And fear could be fears such as this belief that if I open my heart to God's love, that God will finish up controlling me. So in other words, I'm afraid of being controlled by God. I'm afraid of not having my own free will anymore. These are false beliefs, but they are beliefs that have entered our soul from our environment. That's what happened with our parents. When you opened yourself up to your parents' love, most of the time it meant opening yourself up to being totally controlled by them. Right? So we have a lot of these kind of beliefs which we impose upon God. So in answer to your question about desire, my suggestion is God will not give you more desire. However, God, through the operation of all of her laws, can help you address the issues of fear so that you automatically have more desire. if you're willing to engage that process. If we go to Elaine next and then back to Joy.
So would that be similar to just recently, I put myself forward for an opportunity and was determined to allow God, just let God be God-reliant rather than self-reliant, and I became really quite agitated about that I was losing control.
Yep.
So then we have the fear, obviously, the same way of losing control if we receive God's love and not maintain our natural love.
Yes, so that's exposed. You started exercising a desire in a certain direction, and that exposed your fear, and your fear will prevent you from having further desire in that direction. And in fact, your fear can totally shut down all desire. We can go totally numb because of our fear, because we don't want to experience our fear. We can go totally numb to all desire. We can become listless and hopeless in our entire life, in fact. And many people, by the time they reach the 70s or 80 years of age of their life, have gotten so much fear that they've accumulated through their life that now almost all desire has gone. And that is the result of the fears accumulating in our life, and not being released. Joy?
AJ, the DVDs are ready at the back of the room during the break.
Awesome. Thanks, Joy. So all the DVDs are ready to pick up at the back of the room. I think this is a natural time to have a break. And if we could come back, if we could make it about 1-ish or just a bit after maybe, usually will be about an hour, wouldn't it, the way we normally go? And we'll continue the discussion about truth and humility.